Can you hear me? Yes. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. This is day 3 of 5. You should all look to your left and look to your right and congratulate the person next to you for showing up. This is heavy material, and it's like a marathon, right? So keep going. Thanks for being here. So I think I'm a master of ceremony, the mistress of ceremony today. Just to give an overview, we have this 10 a.m. lecture starting a little bit late, but I'll end at 11:05 and then give you much of your break back. We'll be talking first about the child migrant story, and then break at 11:30, and then I'm back up, lecture 8, Surrealism of Falling in Immigration, and I've added 9/11 stories. Lunch at 1, and then a lecture on AI by Professor Singh, and then a tutorial. So you know the drill by now, right? For the tutorial, we're trying to save paper, so we don't have a printout of the tutorial every day. We do have it on Word here, but as you remember from last time, getting 4 pages of a Word document so everyone can see it, the whole thing all at once is impossible. So if we go through a passage that you're interested in, maybe take a picture with your phone so you have it, you know where to start. Same thing with the discussion questions. There are no surprises on the assessments at this point, right? The passages on the slides are the passages on the assessment. The questions on the slides are the questions on the assessment. So if you take a picture, if you know right away what you want to write about, be prepared that way. With that said, I guess we should jump in, right? Can you see the slides with the lights on? You all right? All right, so this is lecture 7, the migrant crisis and the figure of the child. This lecture begins where we left off with our reading of Jhumpa Lahiri's Going Ashore. By reconsidering what references to displaced families in a refugee camp have to do with a story that generally seems to be about 2 lovers and the tragic death of a lover during the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004. Coming back to this quote, I think we had it yesterday, right? I'm stuck on it. Why is this passage here in this story about the tsunami? Yesterday we looked at this passage about Kaushik's view of his own photography. Quote, he was reminded of his family's moves every time he visited another refugee camp. Every time he watched a family combing through rubble for their possessions. In the end, that was life. A few plates, a favorite comb, a pair of slippers, a child's string of beads. Yesterday, we said this imagery about the refugee camp, detailing possessions strewn everywhere, uncannily anticipates the aftermath of the tsunami that closes the story. Rubble left where houses and cottages were on the shore, the only sign of life in our imagination, a favorite comb or a string of beads. In this moment, Kaushik's frequent moves as a child relate to his photographic interests in refugee camps, and this imagery further becomes bound up in the future with coverage of catastrophes. But I want to use this final phrase, this child's string of beads, as a starting point today, because it particularly emphasizes the vulnerability and point of view of a child, a figure foundational to trauma studies, dating back to Freud's analysis of the dream of the burning child from the Dream Book, Interpretation of Dreams. And since we are back to thinking about Kaushik, about the power of his photography as a kind of archive, not to mention the website of his photographs Hema looks at to feel close to him, I wanted to reflect on the significance of the archive in preserving memory, particularly for the purposes of this presentation, the memory of the experiences of migrant children. I'm very interested in a novel by Valeria Lucelli called the the Lost Children Archive. And I gave you material from Lucielli called Tell Me How It Ends. That's the nonfiction version of the novel she writes called The Lost Children Archive. So I'm interested in this word archive that has to do with lost children, that has to do with migrant children, that has to do with children crossing the US-Mexico border all by themselves. How do we document that? That's a question for trauma studies, too. I have to admit that my work is obsessed with the archive. As far back as 2009, I wrote a piece on undergraduate research called, quote, Archiving the Archive, Digital Humanities in and the Future of Undergraduate Research. The premise of that piece is that as an archivist by training, as someone who has worked in the archives at Yale, the British Library, University of California, New York Public Library, Stanford Library, and the Deutsche Literary Archive, it has become difficult to engage, quote unquote, digital natives in archival work, as I understand it. More frequently, I wrote in that piece, I find myself working with students more interested in what we now call the digital humanities, that is probably many of you, rather than working with the archived, unpublished text on the page, much less with dusty newspaper clippings in the reading room of a university library. And I didn't know then that my robust defense of an evolving sense of archival work, what I now know, which is that my thinking about archives in the very literal sense also reflects at some level my investment in the concept of the archive in the figurative sense, in the sense that archives hold memories, like the Lost Children's Archive, and that traumatic experience often disrupts the straightforward memorialization. In 2023, I found myself once again obsessed with the archive, especially when engaging with Sarah Sink, a friend and colleague and collaborator, whose new work on archiving survivors' experiences with COVID-19 became kind of prominent in our conversations. I think once again we are in the position both to think about what it means to organize and process memory on the one hand, and how we might understand the value and function of trauma studies on the other hand. So, questions for this lecture: what is the relationship between the archive and trauma studies? And how does that relationship help us underline the significance and often forgotten story of child immigrants? In this moment of disruption and upheaval, I wonder, why does trauma studies, a theory for understanding the costs and benefits of establishing an archive, not seem particularly relevant to people outside of the university? And how can thinking about the perfect case of recording the history of the child migrant shed light on these two mutual problems? If we can answer this, I feel like we, and when I say we, I mean all of us in this room, all trauma theorists in our own right, can have an answer for the criticisms trauma theory experienced in 2021. Just when it seemed we needed more than ever a way to articulate our current day. It did seem unexpected, as I said on Monday, that at the end of 2021, trauma theory received such pronounced backlash in such widely read publications as Harper's and The New Yorker. This is a sign for me that if trauma theory does seem inadequate to the moment of real illness and trauma, then perhaps we need to work harder to communicate its value to the larger world. This kind of update is why we are gathered here today. I think it is safe to say we need a new generation of trauma scholars to point the way forward. That is you. There's so many new issues and critical applications that you are all working on. You too are interested in memory and the archive. You are interested in human suffering. By the end of the lecture today, I will also propose that the figures of the very children in trauma texts also point the way forward with their uncanny use of language that inspires shock and awe. With such 21st century worries such as homelessness, the school to prison pipeline, drug addiction, increased illness likely due, someone pointed out yesterday, to pesticides and chemicals in the food that we eat, the climate crisis and the after effects of the pandemic, not to mention perpetual wars and the legacy of colonialism, I feel like you all need to do the work to show the relevance of trauma theory once again. My work is 20 years old. Your work is just starting out. So please take the baton after our meetings this week. I say this with the knowledge that trauma theory was born out of a very specific moment, one occupied with Holocaust memorialization, the Vietnam War, the aftermath of the bombing of Hiroshima, World War I. And surely, as you have all pointed out, there are many new applications we might explore. I wanted to continue today that exploration with a consideration of representations of immigration, and in this case, the vulnerability of an immigrant child. We talked on Monday about the need for such translation, most prominently in Will Self's A Posthumous Shock, How Everything Became Trauma. We did not talk as much about Parul Segal's essay entitled The Case Against the Trauma Plot, which appeared in the December 27 issue of The New Yorker. Segal's attack seemed so over the top that Stanford author Jamie Hood responded with her own book called Trauma Plot, A Life. The title of Hood's book references a moment of backlash in literary criticism and literary circles following that publication in The New Yorker by Segal. His article was called The Case Against the Trauma Plot. Jamie Hood had some disagreements with the article. She said, but more importantly, she took issue with how language from the article was weaponized by others to disparage testimonial literature and art. The place, quote, created permission for people to put forward anti-feminism under the guise of the aesthetic critique. While Hood fully covers testimony of women who have been sexually assaulted, I would also like to think once again of the importance of testimonial literature about vulnerable children at the border. In so doing, I do not want to lose sight of the fact that we need a theory of trauma that is adequate to the moment. And we talked a little bit about this, Kathy Caruth's response to the attacks in the Harper's letter to the editor that followed the piece by Will Self. She said that she defends trauma's foundations on the dual values of a careful act of listening, that goes back to day one, and an openness to what is not yet fully understood. And this focus on the traumatic address of an other, an idea at the core of trauma studies, is what gets me back to the archive, to the focus on children in novels about the global refugee crisis and beyond. What brought me to this topic are two exemplary sentences from recent novels. The first is Omar Al-Akkad's 2021, What Strange Paradise. The novel begins with this: the child lies on the shore, face down, with his arms outstretched. The child appears from a distance, as though playing at flight. Valeria Lucielli's 2019 novels, The Lost Children Archive, wonders, were they to find themselves alone crossing borders and countries, would my own children survive? Here is a focus on the child like Caruth's focus on the child in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the Fort Da game of Freud's grandson pointing the way out of traumatic grief, insisting that our futures depend upon helping the children survive. For me, the figure of the child is the figure of the future. That is how we progress as humans, right? We need children to live in order to flourish as a human species. By most critical accounts, two of the best novels about migration thus far in the 21st century, Lucielli's Lost Children's Archive, a novel, and L. Akkad's What Strange Paradise, reveal the impossibility of accounting for the lost lives of children during the present-day global refugee crisis. Even before images emerged of abandoned carriages in the Ukraine, for example, that was an iconic image last year, I think, Lucielli, a Mexican-born writer who worked for New York City's Federal Immigration Court, and Al Akkad, an Egyptian-Canadian novelist who was a reporter based in Afghanistan and Guantanamo Bay, so like both journalists in their way, attempted to archive through literary language the effects of global atrocities on the most vulnerable among us. Both novels are highly elusive, with Al Akkad's novel beginning with the vision of a small child in the figure of Icarus, lying face down on the shore, as if formerly in flight. Al Akkad's opening sequence also resonates with the photograph seen around the world. I don't know if you remember this. I was going to find it for you, and then I thought I would issue a trigger warning, and then I thought maybe I would just leave this to all of our imaginations. But the opening sequence reflects an actual literal photograph that was passed around the world of 3-year-old Syrian boy who drowned in September 2015 in the Mediterranean Sea. Similarly, Lucielli's novel represents at its heart the character's fascination with another book about lost children. Inside the book, there is another book, and that book is called Elegies for Lost Children, a self-referential figure for the novel we hold in our hands, a novel about a mother on a trip with her family as she documents lost children who are refugees. Such an investment in these stories about migrant children is no coincidence, I argue. They betray an international desire to document the history of lost and vulnerable children in the literal world, children who are abandoned and fleeing for their lives. Such texts, in their self-referential, highly elusive, textured ways, point up the limits not only of trauma narratives, but also of the archive we cling to as a way to capture an historical moment in time. Luiselli's title alone, The Lost Children Archive, plays at paradoxes, as it fails fully to archive the lives and memories of the children. Perhaps then, I argue, that we may look to refugee literature published in the last 5 years as a guide for updating the theoretical discourses of trauma in the 21st century. Luiselli's Lost Children Archive reveals not the impossibility, but maybe the very failure of accounting for the lost lives of children during this crisis. At the heart of the novel is the very question we must ask ourselves, that we must ask of trauma theory. How do we tell the story of those who seem forever lost? In asking this question, we may return to Derrida's 1994 formulation of the archive in Memory, the Question of the Archives, where he theorizes a future possibility in the archive, the embodiment of new and productive ways to understand history. We've talked about all the heavy hitters so far, right? Freud, de Man, Lacan. You had to know that Derrida was going to come in here at some point, right? But I'm mostly interested in him because he talks about the archive in these really sophisticated, paradoxical ways. I think when we think about archive, it's like in the past. It's in an old room in a library, kind of locked up. But there's a kind of danger to that, right? Because it means that the past has been left in the past. And so I think about like these theorizations of the archive along the lines of trauma to kind of bring it into the present. In his essay, Derrida begins with the notion that archive comes from archi, meaning commencement and commandment, and theorizes that there is future possibility in the archive. He returns to the age-old idea of the archive to theorize new and productive ways to understand history. However, I argue that 21st century novels about migrant children have tested this very idea. If we have not failed Derrida's idealized vision, then we have certainly failed ourselves. We have not used the archive to the full extent it offers, at least not in the sense of commemorating and memorializing the suffering of migrant children. Photography does that, and I would propose literary language does that. Literary novels have done so where other forms of institutional knowledge have failed. The archive for Derrida is a place of commencement, beginning and ends, and so too is a place of sickness and passion. We have all that a passion that we have to hold on to history. There are French speakers in here who will do much better with this pronunciation than me, so it's there on the slide. For Derrida, we are mal d'archives, in need of archives, listening to the French idiom, and in it, the attribute of en mal de. To be en mal d'archives can mean something other than to suffer from sickness. It is to burn with a passion. It is never to rest interminably from searching for the archive right where it slips away. The sickness for the archive, I think, is interesting and important. Looking back at this essay now, nearly 30 years later, in the face of another migrant crisis affecting the lives of countless children, and through the perspectives of these 21st century novels, Derrida's work on beginnings and endings, as found in the archive, seem almost quaint. So much of this history has slipped away, and maybe that is his point. And while I do not have an answer, I would like to call for an update of some of these ideas in light of literary migrant novels that focus, as trauma studies of the 1990s to the present day focuses, on the figure of the child. What would it mean, I ask in 2025, to think of the archive not as the future? And here again, I'm arguing with my own writing on the late 20th century novels with World War II refugee children at the center. An essay that finds hope in Derrida's ideas. So much that I called that essay Archive Future. We'll talk about that in a moment. But as a failure, what if we thought about our current moment in terms of archive failure? A failure to keep safe even the histories of our collective pasts, to bear witness to children separated from their parents at the border and lying face down in the sand after a failed attempt at escaping to safe shores. What would it mean to read the figures of children in these two novels I referenced as challenging our confidence in the archive, as much as it pains me to say so, one that fails to remember anything about them outside of the pages of the fiction we hold in our hands? And what would it mean to build on, but then also update, the tenets of 1990s trauma studies with a focus on the ethical witness, testimony, and future possibility of the figure of the child to account for so much loss in this pandemic age? So just to kind of take a step back there, I would say we've done some really nice close readings, I think, of what Carruth says about the child, about what Freud says, about what Lacan says. Their figures of the child have to do with World War II, the Holocaust, with World War I. But these ideas have not been updated so much since the 1990s, right? And so, what I'm trying to articulate here is that you all have ideas in your heads about things that you can write about involving trauma, and even involving trauma and the child. The child in illness, the child in immigration, the child in homelessness, the child with incarcerated parents. So, this is me just kind of opening the question once again for all of you. Sometimes I think maybe it is not necessarily fiction we need, but rather creative nonfiction, the testimony or traumatic account that Parul Sehgal wrote against in the trauma plot. Louise Selle authored not only the Lost Children Archive, a lovely novel you should read if you're interested in this topic, but also the nonfiction partner piece, which you do have, called Tell Me How This Ends, an essay in 40 questions. The 40 questions are the questions she asks as a professional, as a part of the intake questionnaire for unaccompanied child migrants. She too is invested in the words of a child, the story the child tells about their traumatic experiences at the border. Of her work, she recounts, and this is in the essay, I hear words spoken in the mouths of children, breaded in complex narratives. They are delivered with hesitance, sometimes distrust, always with fear. I have to transform them into written words, succinct sentences, and barren terms. The children's stories are always shuffled, stuttered, always shattered beyond repair of a narrative order. The problem with trying to tell their story is that it has no beginning, no middle, and no end. While Luciele has as her primary focus the unsophisticated language of the child, we might also say she is describing here a child's representation of her own trauma, that is, the child's trauma, especially as it is without order, it is shattered beyond repair. The defamiliarizing language of the child shocks her into awareness when she later asks a teenager why they did not eat the 2 allowed frozen sandwiches per day in what is known as the ice box. I didn't eat those things, the teenager says, because they give me belly sadness. This belly sadness, itself not a common term, is so powerful because it combines the idea of an upset stomach with upset emotion. Luciele has had her own kind of belly sadness from doing this work. She is overcome by the injustice of it. Children coming to the border without their parents, hoping for asylum, protection, and a path to citizenship. She seeks justice for them. She says, and perhaps the only way to grant any justice, were that even possible, is by hearing and recording these stories over and over again so that they come back always to haunt and shame us. Because being aware of what is happening in our era and choosing to do nothing about it has become unacceptable. Because we cannot allow ourselves to go on normalizing horror and violence. Because we can all be held accountable if something happens under our noses and we don't care even to look. Here, Luciele does not hold back. She seems to be repeating the model of social trauma Carruth picked up from AIDS activists. She also, in so doing, calls for an ethical witness. She wants us all to be held accountable to these children. But perhaps even more than her heightened language here about the injustices in the world is the child's words regarding belly sadness. So, I want to end this lecture by looking beyond the language and images of the figure of the migrant child to look further back to the way a child's language in post 9/11 literature calls attention to injustices in the world. It's the child's voice once again we can turn to for lessons about our current day. And when I say post 9/11, I mean literature about 9/11, but also just literature published after 2001. It is language that, although characterized via misunderstandings, errors, or mistakes, nevertheless create new meanings and new possibilities. It is in these new possibilities, I argue, that post-contemporary authors see a future in a way that post-Holocaust writers seem to reject. There is a way to read some of this language in terms of parapraxis, defined via psychoanalysis as a slip of the tongue, an error in speech that nevertheless successfully communicates an unconscious wish. One example comes from decades ago. Here's one from my personal life. Working on the middle school newspaper at my son's then middle school, when a sixth grader writing about the Paris terrorist attacks described an after effect as night mirrors, mirrors. Not nightmares, she said, but night mirrors. She had misheard all of this time how her sister referred to her own nightmares, choosing instead the more accurate term. During the night, our minds reflect back to us like a mirror everything that bothers us during waking life. I use this as an example of like the creative impulse with language that a child uses, a way of using language that makes us wake up and think, wow, that's really interesting, right? Belly sadness, night mirrors. In the past, I've argued that contemporary authors rely on representations of the vulnerable, mute, ill, or murdered child as an anti-reparative figure in order to connote social disintegration and the haunting effects of the 20th century. However, maybe it can be said that in the 21st century, the figure of the child appears to evolve from vulnerable, dying, or dead to embodying a new hope in the face of extremity. So is it possible to think that literature itself, like a whole literary tradition, right? We think about the tradition from Romanticism to Victorianism to modernism to contemporary. What if something new emerged after, say, 2001 or 2005? And what we see in that newness is this creative way that a child uses, as represented, the child uses language, kind of pointing to a new hope. Some examples of this include Jonathan Safran Foer's Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, Cormac McCarthy's The Road, Don DeLillo's Falling Man. I can give you some dates. Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close is 2005. Cormac McCarthy's The Road, 2006. Don DeLillo's Falling Man, 2007. Anthony Doerr's All the Light We Cannot See, 2014, where the figure of the child has returned as the figure of the future in a cultural landscape otherwise bleak with mourning and regret. Rather than focus on child's play, as was the tendency of Sigmund Freud in seeking hope after World War I and beyond the pleasure principle, I now turn to the figure of parapraxis, failures in language that nevertheless foresee the possibilities of the future as heard in the voice of a child. And in making this argument, I would also say that Kathy Carruth's theory of trauma has changed from the 1990s, late 1990s, into the 21st century. Her new book, Literature in the Ashes of History, the title itself calling attention to rebuilding after the world we now know has turned to ash. In the new book, Carruth underlines not the child's play and the nightmares with regard to war. But she understands or underlines the child's enigmatic move in the theory of trauma from the drive for death to the drive to life, from the reformulating of life around the witness to death to a possibility of witnessing and making history in creative acts of life. One way to read this is to understand Carruth herself as going back to her early work to say, I once read Freud's representation of the child's game as a witness to death. But what if we thought the focus there on the child's game was on the creative acts of life? And I want to think about a child's language, even the parapraxes, as a sign of creative acts of life. In returning to Beyond the Pleasure Principle after the events of 9/11, in other words, her focus in Literature in the Ashes of History turns not to the problem of traumatic survival in the wake of war, but rather to the possibilities that art brings. The act of making history through creativity, such as the child's play, language, literature, and art. More striking still is the temporality of this creative making, as Carruth speculates that, quote, stories of trauma cannot be limited to catastrophes they name, and the theory of catastrophic history may ultimately be written in a language that already lingers, after the end, in a time that comes to us from the other shore, from the other side of the disaster. Here I read Carruth as saying that trauma leaves in its wake not simply full-scale destruction, what she calls the catastrophic, but also language or creation that comes not simply, but paradoxically, from the future, from the other side of the disaster. I'm going too slow. We want time to discuss, right? Okay, so I'll skip ahead a little and connect Carruth's new focus on the future with another book by Amir Eshel called Futurity, Contemporary Literature and the Quest for the Past. Futurity, Contemporary Literature and the Quest for the Past, and that's 2013, and explores works that make available, quote, the open future possible in an era that has witnessed upheaval on an unprecedented scale and that doubts the very notion that we can affect tomorrow. So one of the things I'm asking is what's going on in the early 21st century when critics and authors are like, future, can we please talk about future now? Because I think we need to do that. That's what the critics seem to be saying. So let me just give you a few more examples of these parapraxes in literature, in the voice of the child, in keeping with what Louis Selly refers to in terms of belly sadness. There are examples that come before then. Jonathan Safran Foer's Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close has been condemned as annoyingly precocious precisely because of his linguistic skills, and I would say that that is what's so interesting. His use of language shows an investment in the new. I don't know if you've read this novel or if it's even interesting to people. I mean, a lot of critics did not like it, but this voice of Oscar, he's a very special, precocious child. He is linguistically creative, so he'll say, I hope I don't offend anybody, succotash my Balzac, dip shiitake, making a reference to the author Balzac, but in expressing this kind of feistiness. It's technically a correct way of getting away that the child has with swears to the more serious use of the phrase heavy boots to signal overflowing grief in the face of his father's death. He is, he tells us, always inventing in order to overcome grief. Critics have focused on Oscar's mechanical inventions, but he is nothing if not linguistically inventive at all. And then there's the child in Cormac McCarthy's kind of post-apocalyptic novel, The Road. It signals a child who is not on the surface linguistically precocious, but like other critics such as Paul D. Knox and Shelley Rambo have argued, I'm interested in the connection between the boy's repeated use of the word okay, a word whose meaning evolves throughout the novel depending on the context and the possibility for redemption following an apocalyptic event. Knox argues that the implications of the assurance vocalized through the word okay reveals that the boy knows he has learned everything he needs, and extends the reference of okay beyond a comfort offered to a dying man. The boy will continue to be physically safe, he tells his father, and will be lucky, and through that, luck will be hopeful. So this novel is very dreary and very dry. Like literally, it's a father and his son like walking through this world of ash. And their only conversation seems to be the father asking a question, how are you doing? And the boy says, okay. And on the surface, you think that is a very dull story. But there's like so much going on in the background. And if you look closely at the use of the words, boy's word, okay, you see that it does so much heavy lifting. Like he creatively uses that word. Okay, a couple more examples, and then we'll go to questions. Like Safran Foer and McCarthy, DeLillo's novel Falling Man features an only child, a son, who must grapple with what he has witnessed. In this case, what he witnessed on 9/11. Here, too, the voices and the language of the novel's children remind us not only about a renewed focus on community and malleability of future generations, but also about language itself, evolving as it does to reflect the time, to incorporate misusages in order to account for the slipperiness of representation and the effect of interpretations over time. So like his father Keith during the moment of the attacks, Justin, the son in DeLillo's Falling Man, spends time looking out the window with his two best friends, using binoculars and talking of this person named Bill, B-I-L-L, Lawton, Lawton. And while his mother thinks they are studying clouds and then hawks, their mother thinks there must be something more. Leanne confesses this renewed sense of terror when she says, "That scares the hell out of me. God, there's something so awful about that. Damn kids with their goddamn twisted powers of imagination." It is precisely the powers of their imagination that allow them to use language and creativity to devise an alternative ending, a new narrative, a fictional coming to terms with the real events of the day. Leanne discovers that the name originates with Justin's friend Robert. At first they think Bill Lawton is a myth, a creation they made, a news story. And Leanne says finally, oh, he was hearing Bill Lawton. They were saying Bin Laden. What happens next in the narrative provokes a sense of sympathy and care. And as we learn, Leanne considered this. It seemed to her, at first, this is a quote from the novel, at first that some important meaning might be located in the soundings of the boy's small error. She looked at Keith, searching for his concurrence, for something she might use to secure her free-floating awe. Leanne's free-floating awe seems to stem from this realization. If language succeeds at one thing, it is at making meaning somehow beyond itself, of knowing uncannily what it does not know, or conversely, of not actually knowing what it does know. I'm going to skip ahead and do one more example from Anthony Doerr's All the Light We Cannot See. It's like another multilingual novel. It turns on like misunderstandings and mistranslations, and it like shows how interesting different languages are when they emerge in a child's head. The novel ends, it's a post-World War II novel, but written after 2014. It ends with a focus on children's speech, with their errors as redemption. In a chapter entitled The Visitor, one of the children, now grown, has an encounter with a young boy named Max, who struggles with making the transition from German to French in conversation. And Doyer writes, Max stumbles through something unintelligible in French, leading an assistant to say, "No, no, behind as in back of us, not behind as in derriere." The survivor, now grown, says, "It is the obliviousness of children that saves us." So the boy hears behind and thinks, bottom, but what the visitor was talking about was like physically, like the place behind, right? The novel ends with creativity and speech, with visitor, and then paper airplane, the creation of a paper airplane, more child's play. Does this reflect yet a new turn in literature? From anti-reparative, that the modernists and the 20th century authors seem to gesture toward, to futurity, the future that children bring, the light that they can see. A post 9/11 writer myself, I would like to say it does. Although they have been entirely misunderstood, they have entirely misunderstood everything. In the children's failure lies a kind of success. Bearing witness, these figures of children, right up to Ella Codd's child playing at flight, or Louis Selly's belly sadness in 2017, seem to insist on assigning language, however faulty or funny or sad or tragic or beautiful, to an event that would otherwise leave us without hope. So my discussion questions in the wake of all of that, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. I'm interested in rethinking the idea of the archive as having potential for the future. I'm interested in thinking about how literary representations of a child's error in speech help refer to the future, help show creativity in survival. And I'm interested in looking at the perfect case of the representation of the immigrant child as a way to maybe repair a popular understanding of what trauma studies can do, to kind of lift those voices from the margins and put them in public discourse once again. So my questions for you are, what are some new directions in trauma studies you are working on, and what is your way forward? You don't need to have listened to the lecture in order to answer this question. Insofar as you've taken my early couple of paragraphs to heart as an invitation to find a new way to use trauma studies that updates the discourse, right? You see new things. You are reading new materials every day. How does contemporary literature about children reflect a failure to archive the history of immigration? How might we see hope in a child's linguistic mistakes? This one I'm kind of interested in hearing what you have to say. Some of you might say they're just mistakes. Sometimes a mistake is just a mistake. And I have spent, the last 20 minutes finding hope in that. And then, why do you think psychoanalytic thinkers are so interested in the voices of children? From 1899 to 2025, they are used as illustrative. So let's look at a paragraph, and then maybe we can think about a question. Do you want to look at some of these representations of children mistakes, or do you want to look at Louis Selly's nonfiction kind of pointed demand that we wake up? Any preferences for what slide you want to look at? The children's mistakes? Okay. So I have two of them. Let's go back to the first one. This comes from the essay when Louis Selle is talking about the conditions in the icebox. She says that when people are detained at the border by ICE, they are put into kind of a warehouse situation for 72 hours. It's called icebox because of the acronym ICE. It's also very cold. It's also very sterile. They give the children frozen sandwiches twice a day. So that would be enough, right? But then, in order for us to remember these conditions, she goes to the testimony of a teenager. And during the questionnaire, 40 questions, she discovers that the teenager does not eat, does not take the frozen sandwiches. And so the teenager says, I do not eat those things. They give me belly sadness. It probably is related to translation, right? But I think this is very poignant. Why would Louis Selle add this to her nonfiction account? How do you read belly sadness as significant? As significant as a success and significant as a failure in translation? What do you think? What do you imagine with that phrase, belly sadness? Yeah. Oh, do we have a microphone? It was over here.
This belly sadness could refer to horror or the fear the child is facing that he is going to confront
Yes.
the border patrol police or other people. And it also refers to it is kind of camp, we can say. Yeah, they are staying in a camp for
Yes.
so long hours, and then they are being interviewed. They don't even know the way, the route, how they came here.
Absolutely.
They had to answer, so all these refer to belly sadness.
Yeah, that's so important. This is not about the sandwiches, right? She doesn't refuse the sandwiches because of the sandwiches. But as you say, belly sadness refers to so many things, like this complex issue of kind of discomfort that is both emotional and physical. A lot of fear, right? Okay.
Like
Where is the microphone? Oh, thank you. Hello.
like the belly sadness could literally translate to like successfully translate what they're actually feeling, because the icebox was literally named because of course it was immigration and customs something uh, full form, but they were also really frigid and they were really cold, actual temperature, and they were giving frozen sandwiches which were actually giving them belly aches. So it just literally shows what they were feeling during the time that they were there. Because it said that the actual time that they were allowed to be there was only 72 hours. But it often, more than often, extended because of the mistreatment they had there, and they also had to go through a lot of uh, discrimination and a lot of exploitation against them, and like a lot of like sadness and stress and tension and anxiety and fright, and a lot of it just encompasses in that belly sadness thing.
Yes, that's beautiful. So the sterility that you point up is really important. It seems like belly sadness like compensates for the sterility in language that the immigrants are encounter in the system, right? Like words like alien, for example, which is a misnomer in many ways. So kind of belly sadness adds a kind of richness and subjectivity to the child. But also, as you say, I mean, we can't discount the fact that the child probably feels physically sick as well, and is not accounted for in the sense that there is no grown-up present to advocate for that child, except for, like the Louis Selly and asking her questions, and perhaps a lawyer assigned to the case. Good morning.
Good morning. So for me, I think belly sadness, first of all, primarily means it shows the innocence of the child. So when that whole country, when the majority of people there are naming these children as aliens, as some otherworld creatures, so this word that belly sadness, they could have just said I have issues with stomach, but they don't know that. They are using these words because their minds are not developed yet that way, but still they have crossed borders to reach there. So it just shows that they are still children. Their innocence that have not left them yet.
Great point.
Yeah.
Yeah, think about that juxtaposition of the innocence that this reflects, but also the deep, complicated experiences that they've had that led them here. If you're interested in train imagery, we talked about that a lot with regard to Freud and Kafka. There are a couple of paragraphs about what it means to cross over on a speeding train, right? Like how dangerous that is. So I love that you talked about that juxtaposition, right? Innocence, but so much experience, and how belly sadness seems to encapsulate that. There's a hand behind. Oh, there's a microphone here, and then we'll pass it back a couple of rows and then a couple of rows again. Okay, yes.
Okay, so for me, belly sadness could genuinely mean like them being physically ill, but for some reason my mind keeps going of them thinking where and how their parents are. That's why they could not digest what they're eating.
Yeah.
That's why they have this pit in their stomach of they don't want to eat anything.
Yeah.
They want to know where their parents are. They still want to know what their loved ones are doing. Even though they did migrate for a better good for themselves, but they would rather be with their family than be a migrant.
Oh, absolutely. I love that. That's like a present absence, right? Where is my mother? We think about parents as nourishing their children. The frozen sandwiches is just a radical reminder that they're without their parents and the nurturing care that they provide. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Good morning.
Good morning.
From our perspective, a child linguistic mistake can show us hope because they reveal creativity, learning, and the mind's effort to make a sense of the world. These sign of growth, not failure, about a child's linguistic mistakes. That's all.
Yes, thank you for saying that. If a grammar teacher saw this, they'd be like, belly sadness. No, that's the wrong word. And what you are saying is that's absolutely precisely the correct formulation for what we are talking about, right? And it's only in that kind of child's creativity that we can fully understand that experience. Thank you. Over here? And then we'll cross the aisle. Oh, there's a microphone over here too. Okay, so let's go here on the left and then move to the right.
Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
In my opinion, the expression adds to associating the pain with physical aspects in order to shed light onto the immense pain that is being felt, in order to express the severity of the pain, like it's associated with somebody who's not into that state of mind or who's not traumatized enough cannot feel the pain someone who is in that state who's feeling. So in order to convey that pain, the phrase belly sadness is used, that, this pain that you bear when your belly hurts really bad and you can't really speak about it because the pain is so immense. That is how the trauma delivers pain to its survivors. Also, it sheds light onto the grief that is being felt by the people who are in that state. It sort of tries to convey that the pain is not just mental but also physical. It's not just limited to the turmoil that's into the head, but now the pain has increased so much that it has, arranged its hand beyond the head and it's hurting the entire body, the entire existence. That's it.
That's a really important comment. I'm so stuck in like the life of the mind, right? But as we talked about on Monday, there's that whole discourse surrounding narrative medicine, the focus on what it means to be able to describe the physical ailments, right? The pain that you feel that seems not to have any words. So that's bound up in belly sadness too, with the focus on belly, or just like the belly feeling sad is the belly feeling incredibly ill. Very good. The act of creativity, right? You said it yourself. If a child does not know a word, they will make it up, or they'll take what they have knowledge of and like put it together, right? And for Karut, that creativity is a source of the future, of survival, which is important to think about. Yes.
So just to add to what everyone's already said, I think like a phrase like belly sadness, something I like about this and the entire passage overall was that there's there isn't too much detail. It doesn't feel like it's designed to make you feel sad or make you sympathize with it. It's just very hard hitting. Yesterday we were talking about how one of the limitations of trauma studies through literature is that the reader can look away. And I think a phrase like this is something that blends like the immediacy of a photograph as well as leaving the scope for interpretation that a work of fiction or literature might have.
Yeah, absolutely. This is emotionally resonant. It is hard hitting. It is in that way poetry, right? It is not manipulative. Does not have an agenda. But this is the thing that sticks with us, right? It's the creative part. It's the literary language that comes out of the voice of a child who makes a mistake that maybe is more effective in telling the truth than Louis Selly's 50-page book, right? Like that captures the experience. Okay, so maybe we'll have one more comment, and then I'm aware that you need to stand up and have a little stretch and break. So you have the final word.
Ma'am, just to add, the belly sadness also showcases the loss of childhood, because childhood is majorly about happiness and everything, but during this time of trauma and the child is the only thing that he can understand is the sadness, and it is everywhere. That's my point.
Yeah, so important, right? The move from innocence to experience. I think the teenager aspect is interesting. We didn't have time to get into that. But that child should be rebelling against parents, right? Like sneaking reading materials. Instead, it carries this melancholy, as you say, right? Which itself is a very powerful testimony to what they've been through. All right, so let's take a break. I forgot what I said about the schedule, but we'll come back at the right time, right? And we'll go on to lecture 2 on trauma and immigration. So thank you, everybody.